Curtis drove his black luxury SUV into the church parking lot, eased into his designated spot, and sat for a few minutes. They'd moved into the new building about a year ago, but Curtis was still in awe of all that God had blessed him and his congregation with. So much so, the thought of it all got him emotional. It sometimes made him cry like a baby with gladness. It was true that years ago, Curtis had been senior pastor of two very large congregations in the Chicago area. Two churches he'd been ousted from because he hadn't been living the way God wanted him to. But having the first 2,000-seat sanctuary in a smaller city like Mitchell, Illinois, was a major accomplishment. Everyone in the area was impressed by Deliverance Outreach, and with how quickly its membership had grown. And Curtis was excited about the number of people who lived as much as an hour away, but still had no problem driving over to worship with them every Sunday. This kind of ministry and support was all that Curtis had prayed for, and he thanked God every day for all he'd done. Curtis left his vehicle and started toward the church. Once inside, he strolled down two different plush carpeted hallways and into his office. Lately, he'd been arriving earlier than normal on Sunday mornings, and while he told himself he was only doing it because he needed a bit of quiet time before delivering his sermon, deep down, he knew the real reason was because he didn't want to ride in the same car as Charlotte. When he'd first begun doing this a few months ago, Charlotte had highly objected to it, but Curtis had insisted this was best for everyone involved. He hadn't elaborated, although his thinking had been that it was better to drive separately since they'd be doing so permanently not very long from now. Curtis removed his navy blue suit jacket and sat down at his desk. He'd certainly loved the office he'd resided in at the old building too, but this one was on a whole other level. It was twice the size. It had a sitting area larger than some living rooms, and it was decorated with the most tasteful charcoal gray leather furniture. There was also a spacious bathroom connected to the office that housed a huge shower and double sinks. And on the opposite side of the office was an attached conference room with multiple bookcases, a projection screen, and a classy mahogany table that seated 20. His suite had everything he could possibly want, and he was thankful. He thumbed through a few sermon documents and then glanced at his latest book, God's Favor and How to Accept It, which had just been released in January. He was elated to know it had made #1 on the New York Times, USA Today, and Publishers Weekly bestsellers lists, but he was glad all the traveling to promote it was over. He'd been out for 5 weeks straight, visiting 17 cities and spending 2 days in each of them so he could do all sorts of media interviews and book signing events, where in some cases nearly 1,000 people had attended, and he'd sometimes signed for 8 hours. It was all a blessing, of course, but the entire tour had proven to be physically taxing, and it had taken him a full week to recover from it. Now he looked at the beautiful photo of his 3 children and soon swiveled around in his chair, staring out the massive picture window inside. Gosh, in only a matter of months, 4 to be exact, he'd be filing for divorce from his 3rd wife. Even more surprising, this would be the first time he'd be the one initiating the process. His first 2 wives had left him, and rightfully so, but this was different. Yes, he'd taken Tanya and Mariah through a lot, but when it came to Charlotte, she'd dished out a lot more than she'd ever taken. She'd done things he hadn't expected, and while he'd had an affair on her too, she'd had 3, and he just couldn't get beyond it. He had forgiven her, but his feelings had waned so much that he couldn't see himself staying with her. Not even for Katrina's sake. And that's who he worried about, because interestingly enough, Charlotte and Katrina held a special bond. They loved each other the way any mother and daughter should, and Curtis worried how negatively the divorce would affect his child. He'd thought about that a lot, but in the end, he'd decided he just couldn't be married to Charlotte any longer. He worried about Matthew too, but the good news there was that Matthew had made it very clear that he understood Curtis's decision, and that he was fine with it. Although Curtis did wonder if the reason Matthew felt that way was because he still hadn't fully forgiven his mother for the 2 affairs she'd had last year. He'd been terribly hurt by them, and in many ways he hadn't been as close to her since. Curtis reminisced about his past a little while longer and finally turned around and reviewed his sermon notes. At the same time, however, he thought about Sharon Green.